This video is part 2 of a collaboration between Monster Maze and myself. If you haven't already, I recommend checking out the first part on his channel before jumping into this one. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. Breath of the Wild is a game about breaking conventions, but I think the sequel might need to be a game about reinstating some. The new direction Breath of the Wild sent the Zelda series spiraling forward in is a very bright and exciting one. But nevertheless, going forward, Breath of the Wild 2 could learn a thing or two from the series past. Breath of the Wild is a flawed game, but I believe most of, if not all its issues, can be fixed by just pulling a few elements from its predecessors. The sequel is now set in the perfect place to learn from not only the example set by the new basis for the series, but also from every title in the beloved and long-running franchise that came before it. That's why today I've teamed up with Monster Maze to take a deeper look into the ideas every past mainline Zelda game has to offer to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild sequel. Last time we covered the first half of the series, from the very beginning with The Legend of Zelda, going in chronological release order all the way down to Wind Waker. Now it's time to take a look at what the rest of the series still has to teach its newest installment. Let's get started. If there is one thing that defines Four Swords Adventures, it is that it's the multiplayer Zelda. Sure, some other Zelda games have done multiplayer, including Four Swords, which did it first, but when I think of co-op multiplayer in a Zelda game, I think of Four Swords Adventures. Breath of the Wild 2 is in an interesting position as far as this gameplay style. Going back to the very first mention of the new Zelda that would become Breath of the Wild, the team told us even back then the mission of the game would be rethinking the conventions of Zelda. The first two ideas for executing that vision they mentioned were playing dungeons in a certain order, or play by yourself. A multiplayer component in a 3D Zelda game is something many fans have dreamed about, and I think Breath of the Wild 2 is the series' best chance yet for making that step. Whether it be a side mode or a co-op option for the entire campaign, I could see either happening. One thing players loved about Four Swords Adventures was its kind of anti-co-op approach to co-op. Sure, players worked together, but every level was also simultaneously a competition for who could obtain the most Force Gems. If Breath of the Wild 2 implemented a new mode for co-op play, I'd love to see the return of competitive teamwork style gameplay from Four Swords Adventures as well.
The Minish Cap had, well, the Minish, a race which has never been seen since. For Breath of the Wild, there was actually a race of tiny people conceptualized, as seen in this concept art. Eiji Aonuma stated that the team decided to go with a direct sequel because, similar to Mario Galaxy 2, they had a lot of unused ideas. Since the sequel will most likely consist of some of these unused ideas, this might just be one of those concepts which will be realized this time around. This too would give a whole different spin to the existing overworld. As you can imagine, being able to see from the vantage point of an ant drastically changes the environment and the way you go about traversing it. On top of that, it's also a great way to introduce new types of enemies like hostile bugs, or similar to the Minish Cap, a standard enemy like a Choo-Choo for instance could suddenly serve as a giant boss battle. This also ties into dungeons. The idea of traversing a dungeon while you are very small could give it its own unique aesthetics and mechanics. The Minish Cap already showed how amazing it can be to view the world through the eyes of a small being. So now imagine that concept but realized in full 3D.
Twilight Princess does a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong, but I think one of its biggest strengths, no doubt, is its dungeons. I know it's always going to come down to subjective opinions when you ask someone which Zelda game has the best dungeons, but I do think something the majority of the fanbase can agree on is that Breath of the Wild is not the answer. Breath of the Wild doesn't have caves, temples, or large foreboding structures scattered across the world as its dungeons. It has the Divine Beasts. As a concept, the Divine Beasts are hecka interesting, and perfectly fit into the sci-fi fantasy mix Breath of the Wild has going for it. But the execution is These dungeons are shorter, simpler, indistinguishable, and just kinda bland. It's very plain to tell that due to so many mini-dungeon challenges existing in the form of shrines, the main objectives of the game suffered. From the locales to the puzzles to the bosses to so much more, Twilight Princess provided the most fun I've had outside of a Zelda game's overworld. The thing is though, its overworld in turn was lacking. And that's where the lesson for Breath of the Wild 2 lies with this game. Finding a balance between creating an interesting overworld with shrine-like challenges and things to do, while also at the same time bringing the main objectives back to their roots with more traditional dungeons.
Phantom Hourglass is a tricky one, since in a lot of ways it's kind of like a Wind Waker light. I personally am not a big fan of the Temple of the Ocean King. I do like the concept of having to revisit the same dungeon multiple times, but I think this idea was better executed in Spirit Tracks. So instead, we're gonna go with something else. One thing Phantom Hourglass had over the Wind Waker was the ability to customize your ship with different parts. And since we previously talked about sea exploration, the ability to upgrade and customize your vessel would no doubt be a welcome inclusion. Alternatively, if the Master Cycle Zero makes a return in the sequel, we could perhaps upgrade that one. The Master Cycle is constructed from ancient Sheikah technology, and Robbie is the master of working with this technology. Similar to how we could have him build the ancient weapons and the ancient armor set, perhaps he could make customizations to the bike using specific parts found in the overworld, making it faster, adding weapons to it, or at the very least change the aesthetics of it.
A lot of things can be said for Spirit Tracks on its own, but the number one thing Breath of the Wild 2 can take from this handheld Zelda adventure is the role Princess Zelda plays in the game. For the first time, Zelda actually gets to play a continuous role in the adventure as your guide. For a series called The Legend of Zelda, it's a little surprising it took them 15 games to make her a part of the adventure, even if she is still just a spirit. In the teaser trailer for Breath of the Wild 2, we see Zelda and Link adventuring together, and I can only hope that means a sequel has taken a cue from Spirit Tracks to make Zelda a part of the adventure in Breath of the Wild 2. After the disappointing lack of influence she had outside of flashback cutscenes in Breath of the Wild, we don't need another damsel in distress situation again.
Besides the use of motion controls, one of the aspects which Skyward Sword is known for is its storytelling. I think there's no denying that out of all Zelda games, Skyward Sword had by far the most elaborate and well fleshed out stories and characters seen in the series. At first I wanted to go for the time shift stones, but we already talked about dimension shifting and time travel in other sections, which function in a very similar way. So instead I would love it if Breath of the Wild 2 would look to Skyward Sword for its storytelling. Now, Skyward Sword was obviously a lot more linear, and I definitely don't want the sequel to lose the freedom of its precursor. But Breath of the Wild did lack storytelling, since most of its significant events took place in the past and were only seen through memories. It would be great if the sequel has these kinds of relevant events take place in the here and now. Couple that with some interesting side characters on the level of Groose, and it would already be a huge improvement. There's plenty of characters who are still alive, like the quote-unquote new champions like Yunobo, Teba, Riju, and especially our man Sidon over here, who deserve some more spotlight and could play a more active role throughout the course of the game.
A Link Between Worlds is a fantastic Zelda game I don't see people mention nearly enough these days. Not only is it a sequel to one of the most highly regarded games of all time, but it's a sequel that builds on and expands on the concept of A Link to the Past in meaningful ways. One of these new additions A Link Between Worlds brought to the table was stripping away the linear structure in which you visit dungeons. You can tackle this world in any order you see fit, and my friends, that is something that Breath of the Wild learned from A Link Between Worlds. The freedom this 2D Zelda experience offered to players is something that went on to reshape the entire series in Breath of the Wild. But unfortunately, something was lost along the way. Items. Yes, A Link Between Worlds still has more for Breath of the Wild 2 to learn. Progression systems in games are a touchy thing. Linear experiences allow for developers to create more intricate gameplay systems and tell their story on a constructed linear path. Meanwhile, non-linear open-world games just let you go wherever you want and say, to hell with it. Okay, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but the point is that linear games provide the developer with more freedom, whereas non-linear games give you, the player, more freedom. Items have always been an integral part to Zelda games. The hookshot, the boomerang, the double hookshot. These items were most often associated with a certain dungeon where you would obtain them, leaving most of the dungeon a puzzle labyrinth revolving around this new tool. These tools were also permanent pickups though. and after the dungeon would become a vital piece of your toolset for the rest of your adventure. That is, in most instances. Breath of the Wild and A Link Between Worlds were different though. These games do not follow a linear structure, so unless these items are restricted to a dungeon of their origin, traditional items can't... Oh wait, hold on a minute. A Link Between Worlds found a brilliant compromise to how items can work in a non-linear Zelda game, and Breath of the Wild totally ignored it. Ravio's shop allows you access to items in A Link Between Worlds. You don't find them in a chest conveniently located in the location you need said item the most, but you buy or rent the items as you need them. I think Breath of the Wild 2 needs to bring back traditional Zelda items. Breath of the Wild might have broken a lot of conventions, but I don't think this is one that needed to be broken. And if you want a non-linear Zelda game, while also including the series' classic item system, I believe A Link Between Worlds already holds your solution.
What could Breath of the Wild 2 learn from Triforce Heroes? Absolutely nothing at all. Alright, maybe there is. We already covered multiplayer in Four Swords, but there is something this weird little game has which we could see utilized in Breath of the Wild 2, namely outfits. And no, I'm not saying that Link should dress up like a penguin or a cheerleader, although, on second thought, why not? But no, what I'm actually referring to is the abilities which came with these outfits. In Breath of the Wild, the different pieces of apparel or sets we collected had specific status effects, and in some cases, like the Zora armor, a new ability. But overall, these were pretty minimal. In Triforce Heroes, each outfit came with very unique abilities, and maybe, just maybe, some of the outfits in Breath of the Wild could take some inspiration from this game. If the abilities are more prominent than just being able to run faster at night, they become a lot more valuable to collect.
And here we are with the final game. What can Breath of the Wild 2 learn from Breath of the Wild? Well, it might seem rather obvious, but since we already looked at exploration with The Legend of Zelda, I want to focus on another thing the sequel could learn from its direct predecessor: its advanced physics engine. Breath of the Wild has a certain cause and effect to it, unlike any other Zelda game. If you set grass on fire, it will start to burn. If electricity connects with water, it will send out a conducted wave. If you hit yourself with the full force of a giant boulder, you will fly off majestically into the distance. If I pick up a crate, launch it into the air, stop it midair, and then walk away, yeah! In Breath of the Wild, the laws of physics have an effect on Link and the world around him, which of course is something Breath of the Wild 2 should learn from and expand upon. It's in the name, Breath of the Wild. It's about a living, breathing overworld, and finding ways to interact with that world is where I'm sure many of our favorite memories with this game lie. I hope and I believe the developers understand that, and the sequel provides us with even more ways to interact with the world of Hyrule through new runes and new gameplay elements. I hope we continue to see the effects of the physics engine on how we play, from new ways we can go about solving puzzles, to the stupid stuff we find we can pull off in the world of Breath of the Wild 2. Also, final notes. Less rain, please. Thanks for watching, everyone. It's been a long road, but that's all of them. Over the past 2 videos, we have looked at every mainline Zelda game and the lessons Breath of the Wild 2 can take away from each and every one of them. Again, I want to give a massive thank you to Monster Maze who joined me for this video, and urge you, in case you haven't yet, go watch part 1 on his channel. We cover the first 10 games of the series from The Legend of Zelda all the way to Wind Waker. Also, while you're there, if you haven't yet for some reason, make sure you subscribe to him. I can personally vouch for the amazing content he's making over there, so what are you waiting for? Go support him. But while you're still here, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, you could do that too. Let us know your ideas in the comments, any hidden gems of a concept from the series past we might have missed, and if you really enjoyed the video and you're still listening to this outro, consider sharing the video with a friend. It helps out both me and Monster Maze tremendously. Anyway, that's it for today, guys. Have a magnificent day, and don't forget, subscribe to Monster Maze.